64 of you there, so let's just get started, and as other people come in they will catch up, I'm sure. So welcome, I'm Penny Foston, I'm the Executive Lead of the National Suicide Prevention Alliance. Our other speakers today are Liz Slynn, Catherine McGill and Graham Blair, who are all NSPA influencers, part of our lived experience network, and also my colleague Jess Warner, who's really very new, only a few weeks in. She's our lived experience network manager, and we're really delighted to have her with us. So I'm going to get us started and just talk a bit about what the NSPA's work has been doing around the lived experience network. We've been talking about it for a long time, and we finally managed to get the funding to launch and start recruiting people to the network in September last year. And part of the work before that was to work with people with lived experience to find a good definition of lived experience. And the one that we came up with includes people who've experienced suicidal thoughts, people who've attempted suicide, people living with or in relationships with those with suicidal thoughts, and people bereaved by suicide. And we're also really interested in how we can include professionals who've been affected by suicide, whether that's bereaved professionally or kind of affected in other ways as part of their work. So that's another piece of the work that we're kind of thinking about. And in terms of the network, there are two key bits. So Liz, Graham, Catherine, also Rosie and Dennis, that you've heard from already today, are influencers who've been kind of carefully recruited and are being trained and supported to get involved in influencing policy and practice and speaking at events. We're providing support and they're supporting each other. And then we've also got an online panel, which is over 230 people and growing, where we can send out surveys and get kind of input from a larger number of people, but it's something people can dip in and out of, so it requires a bit less commitment. And we really wanted to give different options for people. So in terms of successes, for us, it's just amazing that it actually exists, having been thinking about it the whole time I've been in this job, which is 3.5 years now. We're also really pleased with some elements of the diversity of our panel, of our influencers. I think there's real diversity of lived experience, real diversity of life experiences and situations and skills. And they're already, you know, the first group that did their training made sure that the second group got an even better experience, because you learn so much in these first two. And so we're really grateful that they've come in at the beginning and are helping us shape it and make it better for those who are coming afterwards. And then the online panel are being really fantastic because the NSPA is feeding into the National Suicide Prevention Strategy Advisory Group's COVID subgroup, where we're looking at specific at-risk groups around COVID, and the online panel have been providing really helpful insights into kind of people's experience of using mental health services during COVID or financial struggles during COVID, and how that's been affecting their mental health and suicidality. So that online panel has been fantastic. We're also working with more local areas, so North East and North Cumbria Suicide Prevention Network and other organisations and STPs who want their own group of influencers. So that's exciting to be working at different areas as well. In terms of the challenges, we did only start in September and it's very new, and we want to really be thoughtful about how we could improve everything about how we recruited and trained and are supporting our influencers, what ongoing support might be needed, what opportunities we can increase the diversity of that. And we're also really keen to think about the diversity and equality. So we had a diversity and equality and inclusion professional consultant helping us throughout the whole bit of the project. Even so, it's been a struggle to get some of the diversity that we'd like. So we're working on that still, and it's something that Jess is really keen to help us with as we keep going forward in both the influencers and the panel. So those are some of the key things that are happening with the NSPA. And now I'm going to hand on to Liz, who's going to talk about a bit about her experiences as someone with lived experience.
Hello there, I'm Liz Slynn. I live in Winchester in Hampshire, and I'm a recent doctoral graduate of the university there, Doctor of Theology, and I'll tell you about that on my next slide. Thank you, Penny. How did I arrive here? How did I come to be a person with lived experience and qualify for that? Well, my life in three parts, really. I grew up, I joined the NHS as a management trainee when I was 18. I did 33 years in hospital management, and in my last 6 years in primary care trust leadership, where I discovered that primary care is where it's at really, and I agree with everything that's been said about GPs today. It's the go-to place. In 2015, 6 years ago next month, I lost my lovely daughter Philippa, and you can see her there. She's beautiful, talented, creative, intelligent, like all of our daughters are, and she died. She took her own life when she was 33. I diverted my research into the field of Christian healing and brokenness and restoration, because I knew all about being broken, as did the rest of my family and her friends. Thank you, Penny. So next slide, please, Penny. Thanks. It's coming. It's slow. So where is here? Where am I? Well, I have NSPA involvement. So I am an influencer, as Penny said, and I'm also at the moment on the NSPA steering group. But my first encounter with making a difference was with Hampshire, and I want to just talk really about good practice that I believe that Hampshire has adopted. Simon Bryant, who's now the Director of Public Health, but was then the suicide lead, was also a former colleague. We knew each other well from days when we both worked in Southampton, which is at the bottom of the map there. And he invited me at an early stage to join the Hampshire Suicide Prevention Forum. And he actually took a big risk, because a lot of people say that people with lived experience are flaky. Well, yeah, we are flaky sometimes, but with good reason. But I was used to multi-agency working, and I really believe that partnerships are where it's at. So some of the times I probably, said too much, but mostly I was in my comfort zone sitting on a forum, and I'm still there. In 2019, we thought about setting up a People with Lived Experience Bureau, modelled in a micro way on Roses in the Ocean from Australia. And so we are now 8 ladies, 8 women who are all bereaved by suicide, and that's accidental, not intended. And last year we were trained in a similar way to we trained for the national influencer role. And we are very involved with policy and strategy, lots of work on bereavement support development, because that's where obviously the main interest is in the group. Funding decisions were included on the innovation board, making decisions with other agencies. And Rosie Wilson, I'm sure, will be very pleased to hear that GP awareness and training, just yesterday I had a conversation with commissioning manager for Hampshire, and that's about to go live as soon as COVID allows us to implement the training, because the last thing my daughter said to her GPs was, "You're not taking me seriously," and that was the day before she died, because she was presenting with a comorbidity of pain, and GPs have such an important role to play. Got lots of multi-agency prevention initiatives and projects such as real-time surveillance, self-harm. Down there by the sea, Solent Mind are looking at seldom heard voices, particularly men, and the Isle of Wight has its own thing going on. We don't have any representatives from there. And amazingly, I've just been invited to join the STP forum as well, so that's fantastic. So thank you, Penny. Next slide. Which is about what's going well and what's going not so well. So going well is top level commitment from the county council. We have member commitment, the leader is committed, we have money, they trained us, we are involved, the public health team are absolutely on this. And just in the last week, I volunteered to coordinate our little group, because as I'm sure you can imagine, the public health team are getting the knock-on effect of COVID, affected workload on the team. So although we still sit under their umbrella, I'm now facilitating the group, which is great, and everybody's happy with that. They've trained us, we're involved in projects, and the people in the public health team and the other volunteers are brilliant, fantastic. I couldn't work with better people. We could improve on diversity. That's why I told you that we're all ladies, women who've been bereaved. We don't have people living with suicidality on our group, and this isn't design. This is the way it's happened, and we want to develop. And we don't have any men. We're culturally, all white and from the south of England. So we want to change that. We would like people to really understand co-production. It should start from the beginning, not from the end, not in the middle. If they're really serious about involving people with lived experience, we should be there right at the beginning. And of course, we all want to return to normal working post-COVID. Thank you, Penny. The last slide. So why are we here? Why is anybody with lived experience here? Well, first of all, let me say something. These photographs are taken by a friend of mine in Cornwall called Karen Arthur. Some of you may know her. She's lost Daniel to suicide 9 years ago, and she is a sea swimmer. Part of her way of coping is to get in the water in the sea every day, unless it's blowing a hoolie, with her friends. And she takes underwater photographs. They're brilliant. And she's called her blog Snapping Out of It. And she sends a message to us. She says, thank you to all of us. And that's not just people with lived experience here, but everybody who is prepared to be part of this agenda, because there are people like her who just don't feel able to do it yet. And this is her contribution. So, you know, there are a lot of people who need us to speak for them. And one of the public health team said that she believes that people with lived experience bring a truth and reality to the decisions and actions that are taken. And I don't need to expand on that, because we do. We know how it is. Until you've been here, close to suicide in some way, it's a new experience. And we want to help stop the loss and the pain. We want to help stop the loss of the people, and we want to stop the pain that person was in, and the pain that then ripples out through that pool into the family and friends. So we bring something unique. So thank you for listening, and I'll pass on to Catherine.
Thanks very much, Liz. So I'd like to share some things with you to encourage you to support the inclusion of lived experience in your services. I was employed by West Sussex Mine to support training at GP surgeries for admin staff, to support their trainers and broaden the offering to learners. The trainers had lived experience of their own, but this wasn't really picked up by attendees of the first session, which was done before I attended. And at that session, some staff voiced the opinion that people claiming to be suicidal were attention seeking and they didn't really have a lot of time for them. So when I attended the rest of the sessions, I wanted to address that, and I made sure to emphasise that I was there to do a job, so they're not to feel afraid of offending me or damaging my mental health with their questions. I had good supervision and support, and that's absolutely crucial if you use lived experience participants, by the way. I asked outright if anybody felt that way about attention seeking, and I talked to them about the darkness and the pain of being in that place, and feedback showed that I managed to create some empathy and open-mindedness in participants. Another comment made by the staff was that they were just receptionists. They felt they were unqualified to speak to people in crisis and wanted to pass them on to the health professionals as soon as possible. So a big step we made with this training was to convince many of them that they were critical roles. They're the first point of contact, and actually very often have to be the person saying no to someone who's in intense distress, given the scarcity of urgent appointments. So giving them the confidence to ask if the person felt suicidal and to then signpost them appropriately was incredibly important. Some of the surgeries already had processes to enable staff to carry on difficult conversations, while others filled in for them and could alert their mental health teams, their duty manager, on-call GP, or even the emergency services if necessary. We encouraged others to look at their own processes in this light. So giving the staff tools and assurance on how to keep someone talking to keep them safe was vital. And we hope to continue that training once surgeries are under less strain again. Having a person with lived experience speak to those staff outside of crisis was absolutely crucial in helping them to understand and empathise. So my main role now is with the Sussex Partnership Foundation Trust as an expert by experience, or EBE. EBEs are given training on how to use their lived experience to improve services in paid opportunities throughout the trust. Staff are encouraged to think about involving EBEs at the start of any new project or the development of new services. And there's a recognition that costs are reduced when things do not have to be revisited and fixed after implementation because the service user or carer perspective wasn't taken into consideration. It can prevent problems that could be foreseen when lived experience is respected and used to challenge clinical perceptions, such as hitting the right tone in documentation advertising services, or scheduling meetings that carers can also attend. Managers being recruited will see EBEs on their interview panels, and those EBEs will have contributed to the questions being asked. They bring a perspective to what these roles involve that peers and colleagues can miss. For example, one I raised was asking a prospective prescription lead how they would handle trying to prescribe something that's almost impossible to obtain outside a hospital after discharge. So there's always work to be done with people who think they can employ an EBE and tick a box, job done. And that's why the EBEs are trained and supported to be confident in their consultation. It's an ongoing process, but I have confidence it can be embedded everywhere and that it's only beneficial to do so. I've been an EBE for just under 2 years, and in that time, not only have I participated in steering groups, interview panels, projects, focus groups, and quality and safety reviews, but I've also tried to work closely with other EBEs and the participation team who manage us to support efforts to improve opportunities or peer support options for EBEs. I've led workshops and focus groups, and I currently co-chair the Brighton and Hove Working Together group, which gives me more insight into other EBE experiences and opinions. I've spoken publicly, chaired all kinds of meetings, and I'm currently setting up an online conference event for the Towards Zero Suicide team. So not only does using my lived experience help improve outcomes for others, but it has also contributed immensely to my own mental health in a really positive way. And that keeps me going in the right direction on my road to recovery, my health journey. Thank you very, very much for listening. I'm going to hand you on now to Graham.
Sorry, hi, I'm Graham Blair. I'm a husband, a father, professional engineer, live in Derby, and up until 5 years ago, I had little knowledge of or involvement with mental health or suicide. That all changed in 2016 when my daughter Emma started to struggle and ultimately lost that struggle to suicide 2 years ago. She was just 14 years old. Unlike Liz and Catherine, I'm just at the start of my journey into using lived experience. So what I'm going to go through is really why I've become involved with lived experience and what I think it brings. Following the death of Emma, I needed to do something and to channel the energy I had into something positive rather than getting lost in negativity and blame. It might be difficult to see on the screens, but I'm not really built for marathons and have no desire to throw myself out of an aeroplane, so fundraising wasn't really for me. I didn't want to set up a new charity as I couldn't see a particular area where one was needed. However, I still have a desire and a need to improve mental health and suicide support to try and stop others going through what I have and what Emma did. The opportunity to become an NSPA lived experience influencer became available, and it seems an ideal way for me to be able to look at helping to develop better policies and strategies, both nationally and locally. So what do I think it brings? Well, I'm not suggesting that it is in any way a replacement for the statistics, the specialist knowledge, or clinical experience. They are all essential for targeting the key groups and developing appropriate policies. However, I don't believe that they always give the whole picture. They can be very impersonal, particularly when key details are redacted to comply with medical confidentiality and data protection laws. It is important to consider your perspective on things and ensuring that you have all the appropriate information available when making what can be a life or death decision. Lived experience brings another side to the story and a different perspective, as well as names, faces, emotions, and empathy. Like Catherine said, it also helps me. It gives me a mental health boost knowing that there is something positive to come out of this. Now, approaching people with direct experience of suicide can be daunting. Being tactful, treading carefully, you might not get the whole story and therefore miss an important aspect. The lived experience influencers feel that we are in a place where we can go into that detail. And while there is always a risk of triggering a negative response, we believe the benefits outweigh the negatives and the risk is acceptable. We all want to improve things and help prevent suicide, and I believe that it is important when making decisions to get as much information as you can. Lived experience is part of that information which we are making available to you. I'll now pass you on to Jess.
Thank you, Graham. So, hi, I'm Jess. I'm the Lived Experience Network Manager for NSPA. And I also have lived experience myself of mental distress, of having made suicide attempts in the past and of self-harm, and of living with suicidal thoughts and of using mental health services. I'm fairly new to the NSPA, as Penny mentioned, so this is my third week. I'm 3 weeks old, but I have been working around lived experience leadership and co-production. There's lots of different terms that are often used, and working closely with lots of other people with lived experience to use their voice or have their voice heard for around the last 7 to 8 years, and it's been particularly around mental health or in the voluntary sector. So I'm going to round up the last few minutes just to really kind of, I guess, take a bit of a step back and encourage us to think about who we're involving, how and why. When I think about the voice of people with lived experience and how we can meaningfully influence suicide prevention, I would really encourage us to think about the importance of a collective voice or collective voices. Whilst individual voices and experiences are so important to hear, it's through all of those coming together as a collective and in solidarity with each other that is so vital when influencing change. And with that, we need to hold space for diversity. So holding space for multiple experiences and perspectives. And I'd say this really must include the voices that are also seldom heard, most marginalised, and that includes people who are disproportionately affected by suicide. And to do that, we need to open up lots of different spaces and diverse ways of people with lived experience having a seat at the table. This may be through directly leading and influencing decision making, such as people with lived experience being part of strategic steering groups, advisory panels, boards, and so on as equals, which requires considering support that people might need to do that. So to make those spaces accessible, whether that's training, mentoring, peer support, for example. But at the same time, there are also people with lived experience who may not want to be working at strategic levels directly, but still have really important things to say that can and should influence meaningful change and practice. So it's important that we find ways that those voices can have an impact too. In the NSPA, this is why we're working with both influencers, and you've had 3 incredible influencers so far in this workshop, but as well as developing a wider lived experience panel as well, so voices can be heard in lots of different ways. I'd say that this work can't all rest on those of us with lived experience. People with access to decision-making power who maybe don't identify as having lived experience do also need to not only hear, but act on what people with lived experience are saying, and also use their power to elevate our voices.
Registered.
And for some, this might include listening differently. Some of the most important things that people have to say aren't always easy to hear. Sometimes they're complicated or nuanced, often painful. Sometimes we might sound angry as well, but they are always important. So I've given some frameworks just on this slide here that some of you might find useful when thinking about lived experience involvement, co-production or leadership. There's not enough time for me to talk through these in detail, but two that I've found useful have been a co-production ladder and also the 4 PIs. I've particularly found the 4 PIs useful. That's was developed by the National Involvement Partnership, and there's some really great resources on the Survivor User Network's website that you might find handy. So I'm aware that some of this may raise more questions than answers. I mean, it certainly does for us, but that's okay. I think what's important is that we're genuinely thinking about how we're working with people with lived experience to have a voice that ultimately has an impact on suicide prevention. And I'm personally really looking forward to working with our lived experience network to do this in a meaningful way. And I'm really keen to encourage anyone who has an interest in suicide prevention to really think about working alongside people with lived experience to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you all so much. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation now because I think what we really want is to answer some of the really interesting questions that people have been bringing to us. I'm going to start. There was one very early on which I thought was really interesting about the fire service. Let me just find it. Is the fire service involved in this group in Hampshire and in other places? So Liz, I know you've already responded to say they're not in Hampshire, but they should be.
Yeah, they should.
I suppose my thought, Debs, is so we've got a few fire services who are members of the NSPA, and I think emergency services in general are a really important group to be working with. And for me, I think I'd put them in that kind of professionals who are affected bracket. There's paramedics, I think, are really in there, that, you know, the police force, as well as counsellors and psychologists and psychiatrists. I think there's some really important groups who are directly affected and have lived experience. It's just not the same, I suppose, as some of the experiences that we've been hearing from. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think about the fire service?
Penny, can I just say, sorry, I read that as, are the fire service involved in the Hampshire Prevention Forum rather than the lived experience group? And no, they're not involved in the Prevention Forum, and that's where I think they should be. And then, yeah, and the rest is what you said. But yes, if the fire service feel they should be involved in the Prevention Forum, and I don't see why not, get in touch with me.
Yeah, great, thank you. Then there's a question from Susie Hayward. We need to have the voices of experience heard at all levels. How do you deal with situations where the thoughts and wishes of those with lived experience are in opposition with what the research says? A simple example could be a group of bereaved family members wishing to place suicide prevention signage at a local area of concern. I mean, I feel as though, I don't know, sorry, Catherine, can I point this one at you as someone who's got quite a lot of experience and maybe this kind of tricky balance that is often being struck?
So I do have experience, but it's all largely been quite recent. And I have found that there are some things that just seem really counterintuitive when you read the statistics or the news and articles and so on. It is a difficult area. I think the important thing is to not feel that if somebody's experience doesn't match the statistics or the information that's coming out, that does not undervalue their experience. Their experience is completely valid to them. It may not be shared by anybody else, but that still means that one person still, or, you know, a small group of people have had that experience and they should be supported in managing that. And there are additional things where stats can cover up what's actually happening. It's very hard to get good suicide statistic information, which I'll refer to in my talk coming up. But yeah, it can be really hard to work out exactly what the stats mean. I think some of the discussions earlier, the first big plenary speaker this morning was talking about statistics and how hard it is to try and align those to things. Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. Does anyone else want to kind of go on, Jess? Lovely. Just the hand up.
I used the hand up. I was going to say as well about research. I think things are changing, but historically, often there was a lot of research that didn't involve people with lived experience. There has been a considerable movement to improve that. So I think that there's something about as we move forward that if the research is saying something that's completely conflicting what people with lived experience are saying, I think there's also something about how we influence researchers to be listening to people with lived experience, because that is part of research as well. So there's been quite a lot of movements around, and not just research asking people with lived experience, but actually people with lived experience being the researchers as well. So there's some quite interesting movements around that. There's a survivors research group that are doing a lot of work around that as well.
Great. Thank you all. There's a very kind of specific question from Jennifer Davies. What sort of training and support would you recommend for supporting people who are willing to share their lived experience? I mean, Liz, Graham, you've both been through at least the NSPA training, but what was it about it that you found helpful?
I think it was, for me, part of it was actually because my lived experience is from the bereaved side. I had, and probably still have really, very limited understanding of those with suicidal thoughts and suicide attempters, and it's sort of getting to understand how to talk to them, hearing their story. But I think it's also what was really interesting was actually them actually doing the same from on our perspective and things. So it was quite eye-opening actually, just being in amongst a group of people, and also even those bereaved had all very different stories. So
and the other area I think is and it relates to the story about research and lived experience, is how to tell your story and when to tell your story. So, you know, we use that as part of our training in Hampshire, and certainly we did a lot of it on the national training, because what you have to try and do is take a big deep breath and try and influence people without, as I know I have done sometimes, especially in the early days, getting emotional and saying, look, you know, you don't understand. So it's, you have to really have to understand how people are going to hear you, and whether they're going to switch off or think, oh, this person's got something extra to say. And I think that's really part of the training that we did a lot of on the national picture on Hampshire.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Graham. Yeah, I think when we were planning the training, you know, it's very difficult. These guys have been so helpful because you plan the training and then you find out which bits of it were really good and which bits of it can still be improved. But for us, especially because we're wanting people to be thinking kind of and helping us think strategically, understanding some of the data and the kind of facts and figures and all the acronyms that might be involved, as well as thinking about, as you've both said so importantly, the kind of other people's experience and how different that is to yours, and how to kind of advocate on behalf of a range of experiences, as well as talk safely and share your story safely. And we also put quite a bit of stuff around self-care, because it feels really important that we're equipping people to look after themselves as well as offering support. And for me, one of the really important things is that you can always say no. And yeah, that's something that feels really important to me. There are some really interesting other questions. So Steve P says, how do we encourage more men to be involved in lived experience forums, discussions, etc.? My experience often is that men form a very small minority, and that if they were more involved, maybe we'd reach more of those men who make up 75% of all suicides. I mean, I'm not staring at Graham, but I don't know. It's interesting, Liz, you were saying that your group's all women. Has anyone kind of got thoughts on this or experience they'd like to share?
Hear it from the blokes.
Poor Graham can't speak for all men everywhere.
No, there are lots of men in this room.
For me, I mean, I don't know, and I don't think, I think it's unlikely that any man's going to stand up and sort of give you the answer to put it all right. I think it's very much down to an individual, and it's just, yeah, it may be starting to approach people. But there are lots of places that are starting to do this men's talk mental health, very specifically targeting men. There's one in Derby which I've started to sort of go into, obviously just online on Zoom sessions at the moment. and they managed to get in some good speakers and bits, and actually, it's men talking to men. That does help, and I think it is starting to break down some of the barriers.
Yeah, there are certainly quite a few of our members who are specifically trying to focus on reaching men and supporting men, and that hopefully will help them grow and start being involved in more of these kinds of things. Sorry, I'm going to move on because we haven't got much time left, but I'm really interested in the kind of safeguarding and issues, but also thoughts about how you involve younger people, e.g. 16 to 25. So our influencer online panel is 18 plus, and we do have someone who's under 25. I think Katie might be in the room. Any other thoughts on kind of younger people? I think the safeguarding is really important there. Jess, were you going to come in? Sorry, Liz, go on.
Well, just what you said, really. I think that, I mean, as you say, we're 18 plus, but I think if it's really, really important, isn't it, to involve young people in this agenda. And there are people here and not here who are very involved in, you know, children who've lost people to suicide. And I mean, my other two children, they were in their 20s, but the impact on them was phenomenal. And for children, it goes on a long time. And I think it's how we do it in a safe way. And I'm not the expert on that. I know something of safeguarding. We need an expert to think about how we did that, because I think it's such an important voice.
Yeah. That's all of our time. I don't want you to miss what's happening next in plenary, because if you've enjoyed hearing from our influencers, Catherine is actually coming up next, talking for 10 minutes. So I really encourage you to go back into the plenary session and join there. Jess has taken a note of some of the other questions and we'll try to answer those as well. Thank you all very much. It's been really great to see you here today and to kind of share our work with you.